Hello and welcome to the Hot News Channel, where we analyze the breaking news. We have a massive deep dive ahead of us today, and this all stems from a single listener's request to really unpack the recent truly extraordinary events involving the U.S. and Venezuela. We're looking at sources covering the high seas seizure of a Russian oil tanker, the audacious, unprecedented kidnapping of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, and just the ensuing international chaos that has followed.
It really is a moment of profound rupture, in the entire global system. And what stands out immediately is just the sheer expansive breadth of the fight from this.
It's huge.
This shockwave has reached from Beijing to Berlin. It's impacting global oil prices, shipping lanes, diplomatic postures. But critically, it raises these almost existential questions about the viability of international law and maybe even more worryingly, the overall coherence of U.S. foreign policy.
Right. Where is the strategy here?
Exactly. Our mission today is to distill what this aggressive action, which, by the way, critics are pretty much unanimously calling gunboat diplomacy and gangster imperialism, what it reveals about the current state of U.S. power and the dark influence of domestic politics.
And financial interests.
And what might makes right truly costs on the global stage.
Okay, so let's set the scene. The shock tactic itself. The sources detail a really sensitive operation. We know the U.S. military, using elite elements like Delta Force, executed this special ops raid, the target, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores.
And the objective was key here. It wasn't a traditional coup, to overthrow the government in the old sense.
Boom.
The goal was the immediate rendition of Maduro, handing him over to the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, to be tried in a U.S. court in New York.
That success in itself is a crucial detail to dig into, isn't it?
It is, because this was a high-precision strike and was executed reportedly with 0 U.S. casualties.
Which is incredible.
It is. And that level of success, it suggests, immense planning, precise intelligence, and maybe most disturbingly for Venezuela, probable internal collaboration.
Someone on the inside.
Some coordination within the Venezuelan military or government structure itself.
Yeah.
This was a surgical military victory against a head of state designed to be swift and just, undeniable.
But then that military action was immediately followed by something at sea that, a lot of analysts are calling even more provocative, because it directly challenged another major power. The U.S. Coast Guard seized a Russian-flagged crude oil tanker, the Marinera.
Formerly the Bella One.
And it was carrying Venezuelan oil.
And this is the action that transformed a unilateral regime change attempt into a full-blown international incident of the highest order. The tanker was pursued all the way from the Caribbean into the North Atlantic.
A huge distance.
And the seizure of a vessel that is lawfully registered under the jurisdiction of the Russian Federation. That's been described by critics across the entire political spectrum as state-sponsored piracy. And just a flagrant, undeniable breach of international law.
Now, this vessel was part of the so-called shadow fleet, right?
Yes, working to get around U.S. sanctions. But the U.S. basically decided that it alone would determine the fate of that cargo, regardless of flag or, jurisdiction.
So these two actions, kidnapping a president and seizing a Russian ship, that sets the stage for our deep dive. Our mission today is to synthesize the sources and ask, what does this extreme use of force reveal about U.S. foreign policy? Is this a sustainable strategy, or is it a sign of panic desperation?
And crucially, how will China and Russia, who were directly implicated here commercially and diplomatically, how will they respond to this blatant disregard for global norms?
Okay, let's unpack that intense opening. We have a successful special ops raid, but the question is still, why now? What were the immediate, beneath the surface objectives beyond just getting rid of Maduro?
To understand the timing, you first have to look at the legal infrastructure or the cover story that the administration built. They needed a justification for what was, in essence, an act of aggression against a sovereign nation.
Right. A pretext.
Yeah. And that justification came in the form of U.S. domestic law. Maduro was indicted in a New York court on DEA drug trafficking charges, including, of all things, possession of machine guns.
Okay, but here's the nuance, right? The sources we looked at, they all say that analysts found Maduro reportedly wasn't even on the DEA's annual list of major drug threats.
Exactly. This is a highly, highly selective prosecution.
So if he wasn't a priority target, the charges themselves feel less like genuine law enforcement and more like a
convenient tool. A foreign policy tool.
The legality is just the veneer for the aggression.
Precisely. Critics immediately called this a temporary legal veneer. The U.S. leadership wanted to avoid admitting they committed a war crime, which would have put them in a very different legal category.
So by framing it as a domestic criminal arrest, just executed abroad, they try to sidestep the UN Charter.
They sidestep the UN Charter, they sidestep international conventions on sovereignty. And it's a huge departure from past regime changes. With Saddam or Gaddafi, the goal was usually to hand them over to internal rivals for, summary execution or lynching.
To maintain a facade of internal justice.
Exactly. Keep it looking like an internal affair.
But using your own domestic law for an international military action like this, that carries a significant risk, doesn't it? The legal cover could actually backfire.
It absolutely could. And this is a point many legal scholars jumped on immediately. By trying to give the operation a legal basis, the case against Maduro now has to proceed through the rigorous, transparent, and often unpredictable U.S. court system.
So what happens if they fail to prove the charges?
Well, if the prosecution fails, or if a regular federal judge who's just focused on the law, not politics, decides the operation was illegal or the evidence is inadmissible.
Then what?
Then the administration would be legally forced to release a sitting foreign head of state.
Wow.
I mean, can you imagine an extraordinary, embarrassing backfire that would validate every criticism of gangster imperialism and probably unify Venezuelan society against the U.S.?
That potential judicial boomerang is fascinating. But let's shift to the real driving motivation, the financial bedrock. This is where it gets really interesting because the sources are explicit. This whole operation moved past the old justifications, promoting democracy, human rights.
Oh, yeah.
And focused squarely on oil and cold hard cash.
Yes, the focus is explicitly on oil interests, on financial consolidation, a fact some administration officials even admitted to privately. And to follow the money, you have to look directly at the intricate and, frankly, deeply controversial role played by Paul Singer and his hedge fund, Elliott Management.
He's often called a vulture capitalist.
He is. And for our listeners, what that means is his firm operates by acquiring the distressed debt of failing companies or even sovereign nations, often for pennies on the dollar.
And
then they aggressively use litigation and political pressure to force repayment at full face value, plus interest. It's a brutal but effective model.
Okay, so how did Elliott Management position itself to profit from this specific intervention in Venezuela?
In this case, Elliott Management acquired Citgo Petroleum, which is the highly valuable U.S.-based subsidiary of Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, for about $6 billion, shortly before the operation.
Wow, that timing is suspicious.
It's very convenient. It was a complex move tied to defaulted sovereign bonds and prior legal judgments.
So this major donor, Paul Singer, a powerful financial figure, now had a direct multi-billion-dollar financial interest in securing control of Venezuela.
Exactly. The entire country becomes the collateral for a debt judgment.
So the operation is seen as a direct tactic to enforce that judgment.
Precisely. You decapitate the Maduro regime, you install a more compliant government, and then the U.S. facilitates the legal transfer of control of Venezuelan state assets, including Citgo.
Which allows Singer to get his $6 billion.
It allows him to realize his judgment. And beyond that single goal, the administration saw it as a way to quickly bring more Venezuelan oil to the U.S. economy, which could lower domestic energy prices and, crucially, protect the petrodollar.
But critics argue this is an incredibly dangerous plan.
They do. They warn that exploiting these resources through military intervention while ignoring international financial stability, it just risks broader global fallout. It undermines the very structures the U.S. relies on.
And beyond the raw financial interests, the sources suggest there were some very strange, almost personal, political and psychological drivers at play here.
Absolutely. The geopolitical strategy was heavily personalized. The operation was reportedly triggered in part by President Maduro's own behavior.
You mean his public dancing?
His public dancing and his mocking imitations of the U.S. president, which were widely circulated and were apparently seen as piercing and personally insulting.
That's incredible. So it's less like foreign policy and more like, foreign policy conducted in the mindset of reality television?
That is precisely how critics define this president's foreign policy. Profit-seeking cronyism and deceitful wars. He's seen as acting purely in reality television terms, prioritizing spectacle, seeking maximum attention, and demanding a definitive win.
Like the sources mentioned, the desire for an Osama bin Laden Situation Room pick.
Exactly that. It's not about a coherent long-term strategy. It's about the personal satisfaction of watching the raid succeed live, satisfying a personal desire for domination over someone who mocked you.
And this action also served to satisfy specific interests being pushed by key domestic advisors, right?
Yeah.
We have to look at figures like Senator Marco Rubio and Stephen Miller.
This is where the internal politics become so critical. Senator Rubio, a powerful Florida politician, his family is of Cuban descent. He views the situation in Venezuela as just inextricably linked to Cuban and Nicaraguan resistance. For him, it's a long-standing political hobby horse.
And a critical part of South Florida politics?
For sure. The Venezuelan regime was just an extension of the communist bloc he was committed to dismantling.
And then Stephen Miller's involvement, according to the sources, tied this foreign military operation back to the administration's domestic obsession, immigration.
Exactly. Miller's motivation is allegedly rooted in an obsession with Latin American immigration. He saw the violent takeover of these countries as a way to contain the immigrants there.
He thought that by controlling the source nations, he could reduce the flow of people north.
That was the logic. So the administration successfully married these extremely different agendas. Rubio's regional focus, Miller's domestic containment strategy, the president's desire for spectacle, and Singer's financial mandate to greenlight this high-risk operation.
So if we step back, what analysts are telling us is that the U.S., through this operation, is essentially acting as a rogue government, one that openly admits might makes right and is just abandoning the post-World War II legal framework.
That is the consensus view among global legal scholars and critics. The administration is signaling that soft power, multilateral engagement, international norms, it's all irrelevant now. This marks a profound return to a pre-Cold War style of colonialism 101, where extraction and brute power are the only governing principles. The audacity is just in the brazen declaration that they'll do it. And this is where the regional intervention transforms into a global crisis. This unilateral use of force immediately exposes the major fissures in the global order, especially when you look at the responses from Russia and China and the implicit reestablishment of the idea of spheres of influence.
Let's start with the most direct escalation with Russia. The seizure of the Russian-flagged tanker, the Marinara. This moves beyond just political posturing. This is direct conflict.
It was an extraordinary and deliberate push. It crossed a line that Russia has historically defined as a direct provocation. The tanker, even though it was carrying Venezuelan oil, was registered under the Russian flag.
Which means it was legally under Russian state jurisdiction on the high seas.
Exactly. As you mentioned, it was part of the Shadow Fleet, this complex international network used by nations like Venezuela, Iran, and Russia to get around the crushing weight of U.S. sanctions.
And the U.S. military acted as maritime police, or as critics put it, literal pirates.
They did. They seized a vessel under another nation's flag. It's a huge escalation, because the U.S. is determined it alone will decide how Venezuelan oil is dealt with, treating its own unilateral sanctions as universal international law.
So what's the expected Russian response? Are they going to go to war over this?
Well, some analysts caution that Russia is unlikely to immediately spark a war over a single tanker.
Okay.
But they see the seizure as such a dangerous push that it demands a decisive, strategic military response, maybe not directly against the U.S. vessel, but against a related U.S. interest, to draw a clear line in the sand.
And how does the Russian leadership see this administration now?
The sources indicate that the Russian government, and frankly much of the Russian population, have largely written President Trump off. They see the U.S. administration as untruthful, deceitful, and just fundamentally unwilling to recognize Russia's legitimate commercial or national security interests, whether in Venezuela or in Ukraine.
They feel the U.S. is just pushing because it assumes Russia will never escalate militarily.
That's the assumption. But this seizure moves beyond commerce. It infringes on state sovereignty via the flag state rule. It's a different level of provocation.
Okay, so if the Russian reaction is focused on military deterrence, the Chinese geopolitical takeaway from this operation seems much more intellectual, opportunistic even.
It is a profound strategic win for Beijing, despite the instability it creates. China had deep, non-ideological ties with Maduro, Their policy was simple. We'll take the oil, we'll invest, we won't interfere.
Right.
They were deeply engaged. A Chinese delegation actually met with Maduro just hours before he was kidnapped.
So China's response isn't about starting a war, it's about strategic planning.
Exactly. It's about absorbing the profound lessons of U.S. behavior and preparing their future political rhetoric. Analysts describe them as salivating over this U.S. action.
Why? Why is this considered such a major political and rhetorical benefit for Beijing?
It comes down to a fundamental geopolitical principle: hypocrisy and precedent. The U.S. explicitly affirmed, through military action, this sphere of influence doctrine.
Analysts are calling it the Donroe Doctrine, a kind of mashup of the old Monroe Doctrine with this new aggressive unilateralism.
Exactly. The U.S. isn't just saying, this is our backyard. They are setting a crystal clear, militarized precedent that every region can be governed by a dominant power through intervention.
So the U.S. intervention gives China perfect political and rhetorical cover for its own regional ambitions, especially concerning Taiwan.
Absolutely. Sources suggest this is the best possible thing that has happened for them in a long time. China can now forever point to the Venezuela action as irrefutable proof of U.S. hypocrisy. It completely counters any future U.S. lectures on international norms or human rights.
It gives them a playbook.
It gives them a strong political playbook for messaging a potential action on Taiwan to their neighbors and, crucially, to the Europeans. They can simply say, if the U.S. can assert its dominance in its hemisphere by force to protect financial interests, why can't we do the same in ours to protect our territorial integrity?
And this strategic comparison is starkly contrasted by how China usually operates in the developing world, right?
Correct. China promotes a policy of mutual growth through the Belt and Road Initiative. It maintains a non-military, non-imposition attitude towards trade partners. It respects their sovereignty, even if the regimes are difficult. And the final irony, as we said before, is that it was the aggressive U.S. sanctions policy that drove Venezuela into tighter relationships with Russia, Iran, and China in the first place.
So they created the very alliances they're now using military force to try and break.
That's the paradox.
Now, this aggression, especially a successful high-tech raid like the one against Maduro, might look like immense strength. But the analysis suggests the opposite. This success is seen, paradoxically, as a sign of U.S. military overextension.
It's argued by defense analysts that while the Maduro raid was spectacular, a high-precision special ops strike, it represents all the U.S. can do now.
It's the limit of their capabilities.
It's the limit of their practical, sustained capability. It's a symbolic, pinprick operation designed for television, not a sign of deep, enduring strength. The U.S. is just fundamentally overextended globally. You've got NATO, Ukraine, the Middle East, Taiwan, and now you add a kinetic situation in Venezuela.
And this overextension translates directly into resource limits. The U.S. can't sustain the wars it starts.
That is the core conclusion. The U.S. military reportedly lacks the necessary resources, specifically munitions and stockpiles, for long, sustained campaigns. We see some specific, shocking examples cited from inside the defense apparatus.
Like what?
For instance, a planned 35-day intense bombing campaign on Iran's nuclear facilities was reportedly assessed as impossible. A critical lack of munitions. A single, high-profile B-2 bombing raid codenamed Midnight Hammer required such a massive logistical headache and drained resources so much that it almost broke the logistics chain for other operations.
And we saw this with the Houthis, too.
Exactly. Even the air campaign against the Houthis in the Middle East reportedly had to be scaled back after just a couple of weeks because they were running out of precision-guided stockpiles and losing highly expensive aircraft.
So the spectacle of a successful raid masks a fundamental logistical and resource problem.
Precisely. The U.S. military is like a high-precision, tool-limited Formula One race car, spectacular in short bursts. But it's not the B-17 Ford factory of World War II that just cranks out endless supplies. And crucially, the U.S. intelligence community itself concluded that a full ground war or invasion in Venezuela would quickly devolve into a costly, multi-thousand troop quagmire, a guerrilla war.
So the special ops raid was the limit. They could snatch the leader, but they couldn't occupy the country.
That was the viable limit of their current capabilities.
Yeah.
Yes. And if we connect the seizure of Maduro and the tanker to the bigger picture, these actions mark a significant accelerating moment in the erosion of international law, a trend you can see not just in Caracas, but everywhere from the Middle East to the Arctic.
The rhetoric coming from Washington seems to be a formal declaration that the post-war rules-based order is functionally dead.
It is explicit. The current administration has stated openly that international law, the UN Charter, the entire post-WWII legal framework that the U.S. itself helped create don't matter anymore. The new operating principle is that U.S. domestic law, a DEA indictment, a sanctions law, can be applied and enforced globally, using military force if necessary.
This is more than just violating norms. It's replacing the system itself.
It's a huge abrogation, intellectual and legally. It's considered a deadly blow to the liberal international order. The credibility of this order, which relies on shared norms, has been deeply eroded, especially when you couple this with the perception of support for actions in other conflict zones, which critics call clear international violations.
The idea that the very countries that champion liberal values could so blatantly disregard them.
It has damaged the system irreparably in the eyes of the global South and rivals like China.
And this disregard for sovereignty is now showing up in other unexpected places, the Arctic specifically, the Greenland threat.
This is an extraordinary extension of this new Donroe Doctrine. The U.S. government has formally stated that Greenland should be part of the United States for Arctic security reasons.
On what grounds?
They're claiming that Denmark's territorial claim is weak, tenuous, and insufficient for 21st century strategic realities.
And disturbingly, officials explicitly refuse to take military action against Greenland off the table.
That's right. They would not rule it out.
Is this just talk? Or are analysts genuinely worried about military action against a NATO ally?
Analysts suggest that given the president's established pattern of behavior, his willingness to use military force when it can be done on the cheap and get a clear political win, he is highly likely to attempt to seize Greenland.
On the cheap, because Greenland only has a population of around 57,000. Minimal resistance.
Exactly. And politically, he is seen as capable of getting away with it because, according to the sources, he has no respect for the Europeans and believes they lack the collective will to mount a unified defense of Danish sovereignty.
That is just astonishing. How are the Europeans reacting to their NATO ally Denmark being threatened with potential annexation by the leader of the alliance?
Well, European leaders were reportedly supportive of the Venezuela action. They were amazed at the audacity of the U.S. against a weak foe.
But now
they are panicking over the potential threat to Denmark. The overriding European priority, according to the sources, is to keep NATO intact.
Which means keeping the U.S. security apparatus, what some call the U.S. pacifier, in Europe.
So they are compelled to appease the administration at virtually every turn, fearful of pushing back too hard, even regarding this existential threat against Denmark.
It's a continent held hostage by its own security dependence.
It is. Europe is seen by some analysts as crumbling, facing stagnant economies, and an inability to resist the will of the U.S. administration. They're forced to accept U.S. terms because they're fundamentally reliant on the U.S. for security, especially concerning Russia and Ukraine.
And ultimately, this conflict over Venezuela, when you look at it globally, it's really framed as a desperate move in the context of the deeper U.S. versus China economic competition.
That is the essential context. The aggression in its own hemisphere is seen by many as a desperate attempt by the U.S. to consolidate power and resources in its traditional sphere of influence.
Precisely because it's failing to compete with China economically and technologically on the world stage.
Right. China is seen as currently being more creative, more innovative, with a vastly greater manufacturing capacity, especially in crucial future sectors like green technology.
While the U.S. economy shifts more toward a finance-driven, debt-fueled model.
Exactly. So in this analysis, the U.S. is trying to use military muscle and geopolitical aggression to compensate for a chronic decline in economic and technological competitiveness.
So after the stunning success of the raid, what does this aggressive act mean for the people of Venezuela and the region as a whole? This action seems intended to send a wider signal.
Well, the immediate aftermath reveals what analysts are calling the Venezuelan paradox. This is all surrounding Delcy Rodriguez, Maduro's deputy, who remains in power.
Which suggests the operation wasn't a full regime liquidation like in Iraq or Libya.
It was a leadership decapitation. And sources indicate the administration seems content for Rodriguez to remain indefinitely, as long as she complies with their demands.
But her position seems incredibly precarious. She's governing under U.S. military and financial duress.
She is walking an impossible tightrope. She issued completely contradictory statements right after the event. First, a fiery denunciation condemning the kidnapping as a vile act of war. But then, within 24 hours, a much more conciliatory statement, formally inviting the U.S. to work with her government.
So she has to constantly appease the U.S., which demands severing ties with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba, while trying to maintain credibility with her own base.
The Chavista Madurista base, who view the U.S. as the existential enemy. It's an impossible position.
And we're seeing strange internal conflicts because of this tightrope walk.
Exactly. The sources detail intensified repression by her government against Venezuelans who openly supported the U.S. action.
So the successor regime is repressing the coup's supporters.
It's a deep paradox. The administration's gamble seems to be that if the U.S. relaxes the blockade and lets oil revenues flow, it might stabilize the Rodriguez regime enough for her to govern, even with a deeply disgruntled opposition. Stability, not democracy, is the immediate goal.
Let's talk about Venezuelan resilience. The country has endured immense economic warfare for years.
Wow.
How has society managed to survive what some sources describe as a genocidal blockade?
The statistics are just staggering. Despite a blockade that caused oil revenues, the nation's lifeblood, to drop by a catastrophic 99% in 2020, Venezuelan society has shown remarkable resilience.
They have adapted.
They have. Daily life continues, even if it's severely constrained. The government had overcome the worst of the blockade through diversification, reliance on alternative trade partners like China and Iran, and crucially, by turning back to robust social programs and the ideological framework of building socialism.
So this history suggests that shock tactics might not have the intended effect of immediately collapsing society.
Analysts' predictions are clear. Far from collapsing the regime, the kidnapping may actually unify Venezuelan society. It gives the remaining Chavista base a powerful martyr narrative. The sources remind us that the population is used to suffering. They've endured color-coded revolution attempts and unconventional warfare for over a decade.
Let's talk about the wider regional signal. This action is explicitly aimed at dismantling what the U.S. has labeled the troika of resistance, Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. But the threats have extended far beyond those three.
That's the threat to the troika of tyranny and the angry tide that is rising across the hemisphere. The administration didn't stop at Venezuela. Trump also explicitly threatened the newly elected president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, and the Social Democratic president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro,
saying the U.S. will not allow countries in its hemisphere to fall to adversaries.
This open, militarized assertion of control is causing a fundamental region-wide political awakening, a radical shift in continental alignment.
Even left-leaning leaders who have been critical of Maduro's authoritarian tendencies are now seeing the existential threat this poses to their own sovereignty.
Exactly. We see this dramatic political pivot. The president of Chile, Gabriel Boric, a respected progressive who had criticized Maduro's government, now he warns, today it's Maduro, today it's Venezuela, tomorrow it could be us.
That's a huge statement.
It reflects a critical realization that regardless of internal disagreements, U.S. military aggression targets the concept of national sovereignty itself. And Colombian President Gustavo Petro went even further, denouncing the U.S. actions and linking the push for regional violence to defruit domestic elements in the U.S., suggesting they want to use regional chaos to distract from domestic problems, referencing things like the Epstein files.
Wow.
This just demonstrates the polarizing effect of U.S. aggression. And the sheer audacity and the financial motivations behind the Venezuela operation, when you couple that with these strange connections involving high finance and intelligence, it raises the question of whether this is just the latest chapter in a long history of U.S. entrepreneurs of intelligence and war.
So let's place the Maduro raid in a historical pattern. You have Panama versus Iraq. Where does this new operation fit?
Analysts largely compare the Venezuela raid not to the full invasions of Iraq or Libya, but to the 1989 invasion of Panama to seize Manuel Noriega.
Noriega was a former CIA asset involved in the drug trade who'd become inconvenient.
Exactly. And this comparison is revealing. It reflects a return to colonialism 101, where the niceties of soft power and human rights discourse are totally irrelevant. Only the strategic goal of extracting a target or an asset matters.
This historical lens seems to unlock a darker truth about how U.S. power operates, especially with the murky connections between government operations, high finance, and illicit activities.
And this goes back to Iran-Contra. There's an unspoken critical leg of the Iran-Contra affair in Angola during the 1980s. The sources detail how profits from secretly selling weapons to Iran went not only to funding the Contras in Nicaragua, that's the famous part, but also to funding opposition forces in Angola,
creating a massive, opaque, profitable slush fund outside of congressional oversight.
Yes. And this complex network of illicit finance, weaponry, and intelligence fronts is precisely where the notorious figure of Jeffrey Epstein enters the picture.
How does he connect to this?
He was directly involved in the relocation and sale of Southern Air Transport, a notorious CIA proprietary or front company that was deeply involved in Iran-Contra business and logistics.
And where did it go?
To Les Wexner's company in Ohio. This company was linked, among other things, to the trafficking of blood diamonds mined in the civil war zones of Angola.
And Epstein himself reportedly claimed his original money came from guns, drugs, and diamonds.
The three pillars of illicit high-stakes global trade.
So Epstein wasn't just a disconnected high society figure. He was an entrepreneur of intelligence, directly benefiting from the deregulation of covert operations.
Precisely. This history shows how the deregulation and financialization of the neoliberal era allowed for the rise of these entrepreneurs of war and intelligence. These figures straddled the world of high finance, political access, giving rides to people like Bill Clinton and dark operations. The Venezuela operation, driven by a vulture capitalist like Singer, is seen as the modern iteration of this imperial grift.
Let's pivot back to sanctions policy, which seems to be a key driver of all this.
Yeah.
How did sanctions inadvertently create the very problems the U.S. is now using military force to solve?
Well, sanctions were intended as a tool of soft pressure, right? To get populations to hold their governments accountable without military action. But they frequently fail. Instead, they often reinforce the control of political elites by concentrating resources, and they force target countries to become more resilient and self-sufficient.
So in Venezuela's case, the sanctions didn't bring about a democratic transition.
No. They systematically drove the country into closer, more resilient relationships with Russia, China, and Iran.
The ultimate irony is that the U.S. created the very powerful alliances. It's now using military force to try and break, overextending itself in the process.
That is the bitter paradox of sanctions-first foreign policy. Furthermore, political advisors across the globe warn that trying to strike a mutually beneficial deal with this U.S. president is inherently unreliable. They describe the relationship as a one-way street.
Because he's perceived as lacking honor.
And will abandon any relationship the moment it becomes inconvenient or boring. This lack of honor undermines the credibility you need for diplomacy, making force seem like the only option.
So we've covered the mechanics of the Maduro kidnapping, the extraordinary seizure of a Russian-flagged tanker, and the complicated, often highly personal motivations behind it, from personal pique to massive financial interests and a desperate attempt to consolidate power. The explicit affirmation of the sphere of influence doctrine, this Donroe Doctrine, has sent clear shockwaves across the globe, giving invaluable cover to rivals like China and exposing deep divisions in the West.
Indeed. The core takeaway from this deep dive is that the U.S., under this administration, is actively dismantling the rules-based international order it championed for 70 years, and is replacing it with the law of the jungle, where American domestic law is declared supreme everywhere, enforced by elite military units. But the over-reliance on these symbolic, high-precision victories like the raid on Maduro, it betrays a nation that, while possessing immense military capability, is fundamentally struggling to manage its own chaotic and overextended foreign policy goals. It's a moment that raises the urgent question of whether the U.S. is even capable of achieving, let alone sustaining, these expansive, lawless new ambitions.
When a government acts with such brazen disregard for international norms, what alternative global organizations must now be created to defend international law if existing institutions like the UN are rendered useless?
That is the essential question the world is grappling with right now, trying to determine the future security architecture.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Subscribe to our channel for more breaking news and press like if you liked our news analysis, and say goodbye until we meet again.